Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country, but standing in the pouring rain at Fort Benning, Georgia, she wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The drill sergeant's voice cut through the downpour like a knife, his words sharp and unforgiving as he pointed directly at her mud-soaked uniform. "Martinez, you call that a proper push-up position? My grandmother could hold plank better than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. The other recruits snickered quietly, but Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground beneath her trembling arms. This was day 43 of basic training, and she was failing miserably. At 22 years old, Sarah had left behind a comfortable job as a computer programmer in Austin, Texas, driven by a deep desire to make a difference in the world. Her parents had tried to talk her out of enlisting, worried that their quiet, bookish daughter wasn't cut out for military life. Looking at her now, struggling to complete even the basic physical requirements, it seemed they might have been right. The obstacle course had become her personal nightmare. While other recruits sailed over walls and crawled under barbed wire with increasing confidence, Sarah found herself falling further behind each day. Her small frame, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, seemed to work against her at every turn. The rope climb that others completed in seconds took her several agonizing minutes, if she managed to reach the top at all. During weapons training, her marksmanship scores were consistently below average. The M16 rifle felt heavy and unwieldy in her hands, and despite countless hours on the range, she couldn't seem to group her shots tightly enough to meet the minimum standards. Her drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams, had pulled her aside multiple times, his frustration evident in every word. "Martinez, I've seen plenty of recruits struggle, but you're not even trying. What's your problem?" he had asked during one particularly difficult session. Sarah wanted to explain that she was trying harder than she had ever tried at anything in her life, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded and promised to do better, knowing that her best efforts still weren't enough. The physical training tests were becoming increasingly humiliating. While her fellow recruits improved their run times and increased their push-up counts, Sarah seemed to plateau at levels that were barely acceptable for someone half her age. The 2-mile run that should have taken her 16 minutes stretched to nearly 20, leaving her gasping and dizzy at the finish line while others barely seemed winded. Her bunkmates tried to be supportive, but Sarah could see the pity in their eyes. Jessica Chen, a former college athlete from California, often offered to help with training, but Sarah was too embarrassed to accept. Michael Rodriguez, who had enlisted straight out of high school, would share energy bars and encouragement, but Sarah knew that even his kindness couldn't bridge the gap between her performance and military standards. The mental challenges were just as difficult as the physical ones. During tactical exercises, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the complexity of military procedures and the pressure to make quick decisions under stress. When tasked with leading a small unit through a simulated patrol, she had frozen completely, unable to remember the proper hand signals or coordinate her team's movements effectively. Staff Sergeant Williams had been particularly harsh after that exercise. "In the real world, Martinez, hesitation gets people killed. If you can't handle a simple training scenario, how do you expect to function in actual combat?" His words stung because Sarah knew they were true. She had always been a careful, methodical thinker, someone who needed time to process information and consider all options. The military demanded split-second decisions and unwavering confidence, qualities that seemed completely foreign to her nature. As the weeks progressed, Sarah began to notice other recruits being pulled aside for advanced training opportunities or receiving recognition for their improvement. She watched from the sidelines as the stronger, faster, more natural soldiers were identified as potential candidates for specialized programs. The gap between her abilities and theirs seemed to widen daily, creating a sense of isolation that made training even more difficult. The breaking point came during a field exercise in Week 8. Sarah's unit was tasked with navigating through dense woods using only a compass and map, a skill that should have played to her analytical strengths. Instead, she became disoriented within the first hour, leading her team in circles while other units completed the course successfully. When they finally emerged from the forest 3 hours behind schedule, Staff Sergeant Williams was waiting with barely contained anger. "Martinez, step forward," he commanded, his voice echoing across the training area. As Sarah approached, she could feel the eyes of every recruit in the company watching her. "You've just demonstrated why some people aren't cut out for military service. Your inability to navigate cost your team valuable time and could have put lives at risk in a real situation. That night, lying in her narrow bunk while her fellow recruits slept peacefully around her, Sarah stared at the ceiling and considered quitting. The thought of returning home, admitting failure to her family and friends, was almost unbearable. But the alternative seemed worse, continuing to struggle through training, only to fail the final tests and be discharged anyway. She thought about her grandfather, a World War II veteran who had filled her childhood with stories of courage and sacrifice. He had always told her that the military taught people to find strength they never knew they possessed. But Sarah was beginning to wonder if some people simply didn't have that strength to find. Maybe she was one of those people who was better suited for civilian life, contributing to society in different ways. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A special operations unit was visiting the base, and rumors circulated among the recruits about possible selection opportunities. Sarah paid little attention to the gossip, assuming that such elite programs were reserved for the top performers in the company. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to take a dramatic turn, or that failure would become the catalyst for discovering abilities she never knew she possessed. Commander Jake Harrison stepped out of the black SUV and surveyed the training grounds of Fort Benning, with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years in naval special warfare. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from leading SEAL operations in some of the world's most dangerous locations. His visit to the Army base wasn't standard protocol, but then again, nothing about his current mission was standard. The Pentagon had tasked him with a unique assignment: identify unconventional candidates for a classified operation that required skills beyond traditional military training. The mission parameters were unlike anything he had encountered before, demanding individuals who could think differently, adapt quickly, and operate effectively in environments where conventional tactics might fail. Staff Sergeant Williams approached with the rigid posture expected when greeting a visiting officer. "Commander Harrison, welcome to Fort Benning. I have the files you requested on our top-performing recruits." He handed over a thick folder containing performance evaluations and test scores. Harrison flipped through the documents quickly, noting the impressive statistics and glowing recommendations. "These are your best soldiers?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. "Yes, sir. Each one has demonstrated exceptional physical capabilities, leadership potential, and tactical understanding. They represent the future of our military." Williams spoke with obvious pride, clearly expecting the SEAL commander to be impressed by the quality of recruits under his command. Instead, Harrison closed the folder and handed it back. "I'm not interested in your best soldiers, Sergeant. I need to see your failures." The confusion on Williams' face was immediate and obvious. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. You want to meet with recruits who are struggling?" "That's exactly what I want. Show me the soldiers who don't fit your mold, the ones who think differently, who approach problems from unexpected angles. I need people who have failed at conventional methods but might excel at unconventional ones." Harrison's request went against everything Williams understood about military selection processes. Reluctantly, the staff sergeant led Harrison across the base toward the barracks, where the struggling recruits were preparing for another day of challenging training. "Sir, I have to ask about the nature of this selection. These recruits are barely meeting minimum standards, and some may not even graduate basic training." Harrison paused at the entrance to the training area, watching as dozens of young soldiers went through their morning routines. "Sergeant, in my experience, the people who struggle with traditional methods often possess qualities that can't be measured by standard tests. Sometimes failure teaches lessons that success never can." Among the recruits going through morning physical training, Sarah Martinez stood out for all the wrong reasons. She was clearly exhausted, her form poor as she attempted push-ups alongside her more athletic peers. Harrison observed her for several minutes, noting not her physical limitations but her persistence. Despite obvious fatigue and the visible frustration of her drill instructor, she continued trying. "Tell me about that one," Harrison said, pointing toward Sarah. "The small female recruit who's struggling with the PT test." Williams followed his gaze and immediately shook his head. "Martinez? Sir, with respect, she's one of our most challenging cases. Poor physical performance, below-average marksmanship scores, and she freezes under pressure during tactical exercises. She's been recommended for discharge twice." "What's her background?" Harrison asked, His interest clearly piqued rather than diminished by the negative assessment. Computer programmer from Texas, college educated, high test scores academically, but she just can't adapt to military life. Yesterday she got her entire squad lost during a basic navigation exercise. Williams clearly expected this information to end Harrison's interest. Instead, the SEAL commander studied Sarah more intently. He watched as she helped a fellow recruit who had twisted an ankle during the run, sharing her water and offering encouragement despite her own obvious exhaustion. When the formation moved to weapons training, he followed at a distance, observing her interactions with both peers and instructors. During the marksmanship session, Harrison positioned himself behind the firing line where he could watch Sarah's technique. Her groupings were indeed poor by military standards, but he noticed something that Staff Sergeant Williams had missed. After each shot, she made subtle adjustments to her stance, grip, and sight picture, demonstrating a systematic approach to problem-solving that was methodical rather than intuitive. "She's analyzing each shot," Harrison murmured to himself, recognizing a trait that could be valuable in the right circumstances. Most recruits relied on muscle memory and instinct, but Sarah was treating marksmanship like a complex puzzle that required careful observation and adjustment. The real revelation came during the afternoon tactical exercise. Sarah's squad was tasked with planning and executing a simulated assault on a fortified position, while other squad leaders immediately began issuing orders and positioning their troops. Sarah spent several minutes studying the terrain, asking questions about enemy capabilities, and considering multiple approaches. Her hesitation frustrated the drill instructor, but Harrison saw something different. When Sarah finally moved, her plan was more complex than those of other squads. She had identified weaknesses in the defensive position that others had missed and developed a multi-pronged approach that minimized risk to her troops while maximizing chances of success. The execution was flawed due to her squad's inexperience with complex tactics, but the underlying strategy was sound. Harrison recognized the kind of thinking that had made some of his most successful operations possible: the ability to see beyond obvious solutions and develop innovative approaches to difficult problems. After the exercise, Harrison approached Sarah directly, catching her as she cleaned her equipment in preparation for evening chow. "Recruit Martinez?" His voice carried the authority of years in special operations, and Sarah immediately snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." She stood rigidly, clearly nervous about being singled out by a visiting officer, especially given her poor performance record. "I watched your tactical exercise today. Tell me about your thought process during the planning phase." Harrison's question was unexpected, and Sarah hesitated, unsure whether this was another test she was about to fail. "Sir, I noticed that the defensive position had overlapping fields of fire that would make a direct assault costly. I thought if we could create a diversion on the eastern approach while sending a smaller team through the drainage culvert on the western side, we might be able to neutralize the position without significant casualties." She spoke quickly, as if afraid he would cut her off. Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing tactical thinking that went beyond basic training scenarios. "And the drainage culvert approach? How did you identify that option?" "I studied the terrain map for several minutes before moving out, sir. The culvert wasn't marked on the tactical overlay, but I remembered seeing it during our earlier reconnaissance of the area. It seemed like it might provide concealed access to the objective." Sarah's answer revealed the kind of attention to detail and memory for terrain, features that special operations valued highly. For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Commander Harrison smiled slightly. He had found what he was looking for: a recruit who thought differently, who approached problems from unexpected angles, and who possessed qualities that couldn't be measured by traditional military standards. Sarah Martinez might be failing basic training, but she had just demonstrated exactly the kind of unconventional thinking his mission would require. Sarah stared at the official-looking document in her hands, reading the words for the third time to make sure she understood correctly. The transfer orders bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command and authorized her immediate reassignment to a classified training program in Virginia. After weeks of barely meeting basic training standards, she was being selected for something that sounded impossibly advanced. "I don't understand, sir," she said to Commander Harrison, who had summoned her to a private meeting room away from the other recruits. "My performance evaluations show that I'm barely qualified to continue basic training." How can I be selected for special operations? Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman who had no idea how dramatically her life was about to change. Martina's traditional military training is designed to create soldiers who can follow orders precisely and execute standard tactics effectively. But some missions require people who can think beyond standard procedures, who can find solutions when conventional methods fail. He stood and walked to a wall map, showing various global hotspots marked with colored pins. The operation you're being considered for isn't about physical strength or marksmanship scores. It requires someone who can analyze complex situations, adapt quickly to unexpected circumstances, and develop innovative approaches to seemingly impossible problems. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. But sir, I've failed at almost everything here. Yesterday, I couldn't even complete the obstacle course within the time limit. How can you be confident I'll succeed at something more challenging? Because failure has taught you something that success never could, Harrison replied, turning back to face her. You've learned to persevere when things get difficult, to keep trying when others might give up. More importantly, you've developed problem-solving skills that come from having to find alternative approaches when the obvious ones don't work. The flight to Virginia gave Sarah time to process what was happening. As the military transport aircraft carried her away from Fort Benning, she watched the familiar training grounds disappear below and wondered if she was making another mistake. The other passengers were clearly special operations personnel, their bearing and confidence in stark contrast to her own uncertainty. The training facility in Virginia looked nothing like Fort Benning. Instead of large parade grounds and rows of barracks, the complex consisted of modern buildings scattered across a wooded landscape. Everything about the place suggested that unconventional methods were not just accepted but expected. Sarah's new instructor was Master Chief Petty Officer Lisa Chen, a 20-year veteran of naval special warfare who had participated in operations on every continent. Unlike the drill sergeants at basic training, Chen spoke to Sarah as an equal rather than a subordinate, immediately establishing a different dynamic. "Forget everything you learned about military training," Chen said during their first meeting. "The skills we're going to develop here are based on adaptability, critical thinking, and the ability to operate effectively in ambiguous situations where there are no clear rules or procedures." The training regimen was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Instead of physical exercises designed to build strength and endurance, she spent hours working through complex puzzles, analyzing intelligence reports, and developing solutions to hypothetical scenarios that had no obvious answers. Her computer programming background proved invaluable as she learned to break down complex problems into manageable components. One exercise involved analyzing surveillance footage from a foreign city to identify patterns in civilian movement that might indicate hidden threats. Sarah spent days studying the videos, creating charts and diagrams that mapped pedestrian flow, vehicle patterns, and behavioral anomalies. When she finally presented her findings, Chen was impressed by the depth of analysis and the unconventional connections Sarah had identified. "Most people look at surveillance footage and see random movement," Chen explained. "You saw data patterns that revealed underlying structures. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need for this mission." The physical training was challenging but different from basic training. Instead of focusing on brute strength and speed, the exercises emphasized flexibility, balance, and the ability to move silently through various environments. Sarah discovered that her smaller frame was actually advantageous for many of the skills they were developing. Language training consumed several hours each day as Sarah struggled to master conversational Arabic and Farsi. The complexity of learning new languages while simultaneously developing other skills was overwhelming, but she found that her systematic approach to problem-solving helped her identify patterns and rules that made the process more manageable. "Your progress in languages is remarkable," noted Dr. Sarah Kim, the linguistics instructor. "Most students rely on repetition and memorization, but you're building comprehensive grammatical frameworks that allow you to construct original sentences rather than just repeating learned phrases." After 6 weeks of intensive training, Commander Harrison returned to evaluate Sarah's progress. He observed her performance during a complex simulation that required her to navigate through a mock foreign city, gather intelligence from multiple sources, and develop an operational plan based on incomplete information. Sarah moved through the exercise with growing confidence, using skills she had never imagined possessing. She identified surveillance patterns, established rapport with role-playing civilians, and pieced together intelligence fragments to create a comprehensive picture of the simulated threat. When she presented her final assessment, Harrison and the other observers exchanged meaningful glances. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Harrison said after the debriefing. "You've demonstrated exactly the capabilities we hoped to develop. But now comes the real test. Are you ready to learn about the actual mission?" The briefing room was secured with multiple locks and electronic surveillance countermeasures. As Sarah took her seat at the conference table, she noticed other team members filing in. A former CIA analyst, a linguistics expert who spoke 6 Middle Eastern languages, and a communications specialist with extensive experience in electronic warfare. "Commander," Harrison activated a large screen displaying satellite imagery of a mountainous region in Central Asia. 6 months ago, we lost contact with a deep cover intelligence asset operating in this area. Traditional rescue operations are impossible due to the political sensitivity of the region and the presence of multiple hostile factions. He clicked to the next slide, showing detailed maps of the target area. The missing agent was investigating reports of weapons trafficking that could potentially destabilize the entire region. "We need to locate this person, extract them safely, and recover the intelligence they gathered. But it has to be done without any official government fingerprints." Sarah studied the maps and imagery, her mind already beginning to analyze the complex challenges the mission would present. "Sir, what makes this situation different from standard special operations procedures?" "Everything," Harrison replied with a slight smile. "The team going in won't be military personnel operating under official cover. You'll be civilians with carefully constructed backgrounds, using skills that have nothing to do with traditional combat operations. Your job will be to think your way through problems that can't be solved with superior firepower or conventional tactics." As the briefing continued, Sarah realized that her months of failure at basic training had been preparing her for exactly this moment. The skills that had made her unsuccessful as a conventional soldier were precisely what this mission required. The ability to think creatively, adapt to unexpected situations, and find solutions when standard procedures weren't available. For the first time since enlisting, Sarah felt truly confident about her abilities. The mission that lay ahead was dangerous and complex, but it was also perfectly suited to the unconventional skills she had been developing. She was ready to prove that sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who don't fit the traditional mold. The dusty marketplace in Kandahar buzzed with activity as Sarah adjusted the headscarf that concealed her blonde hair. 2 months of intensive preparation had transformed her from a struggling recruit into someone who could blend seamlessly into Central Asian society. Her cover identity as a freelance journalist, documenting women's education initiatives, had taken weeks to establish, complete with published articles and a social media presence that dated back several years. Standing beside a fruit vendor's stall, Sarah scanned the crowd through dark sunglasses while appearing to examine oranges. Her team was scattered throughout the market, each member playing their assigned role in what appeared to be random civilian activity. Marcus Webb, the former CIA analyst, haggled with a carpet seller 2 stalls away. Dr. Amira Hassan, their linguistics expert, conducted an interview with local women near the school entrance. Communications specialist Tommy Chen monitored radio frequencies from a tea house overlooking the square. The missing agent, codenamed Falcon, had last been seen in this area 6 weeks ago. Intelligence suggested he had been investigating a weapons trafficking network that moved advanced military equipment through the mountains into neighboring countries. His final transmission had indicated he was close to identifying the network's leadership, but then all contact had ceased. Sarah's earpiece crackled with Tommy's voice. "Phoenix, I'm picking up encrypted radio traffic from the building across the square. Same frequency patterns we identified in Falcon's last transmission." Phoenix was Sarah's operational code name, chosen to symbolize her rise from the ashes of basic training failure. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah identified the building Tommy referenced. It was a 3-story structure with a carpet shop on the ground floor and what appeared to be offices or apartments above. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and she noticed several men in local dress who carried themselves with military bearing despite their civilian clothes. "Copy that. Overwatch, Sarah replied quietly using Tommy's call sign. Raven, can you get eyes on the upper floors? Raven was Marcus's designation, reflecting his ability to observe and analyze from unexpected vantage points. Marcus's response came through clearly. Working on it. The carpet seller says the building owner rents space to foreign businessmen who come and go at irregular hours. Sounds like our target location. Dr. Hassan's voice joined the conversation. Falcon was researching women's education funding as his cover. Several locals remember him asking questions about which schools received equipment donations from international sources. That building houses an educational supply company on the second floor. Sarah felt the familiar surge of analytical thinking that had served her well throughout training. The pieces were forming a pattern, but she needed more information before recommending action. Team, maintain positions and continue gathering intelligence. Phoenix is going to conduct close reconnaissance. She purchased oranges from the vendor, engaging in the expected haggling process while carefully observing the target building. The ground floor carpet shop had two entrances, one facing the main square and another on a side street. The upper floors were accessible through a separate entrance that was partially concealed by hanging carpets. As Sarah moved closer to the building, she noticed subtle security measures that weren't immediately obvious. The hanging carpets positioned around the side entrance would make surveillance difficult, but they also restricted easy escape routes. Two men sitting at a nearby tea stall maintained clear sight lines to both entrances, while appearing to engage in casual conversation. Overwatch. I count at least 4 security personnel maintaining perimeter watch, Sarah reported quietly. This location is definitely operational, not just a safe house. Tommy's voice carried urgency. Phoenix, the encrypted traffic is increasing. I'm detecting what sounds like preparation for personnel movement. Something's happening. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. If the trafficking network was preparing to move, they might be evacuating evidence or relocating personnel. If Falcon was being held in the building, this could be their last opportunity to locate him before he was moved to a more secure location. Raven, what's your assessment of the tactical situation? She asked Marcus, knowing his experience would be valuable in evaluating their options. Security is tight, but not military level. These guys are professionals, but they're focused on preventing surveillance rather than repelling an assault. If we're going to make a move, it needs to be subtle and smart rather than forceful. Marcus's analysis confirmed Sarah's own observations. Dr. Hassan's voice added another crucial element. Phoenix, I just learned something important. The educational supply company upstairs recently received a large shipment of computer equipment, supposedly for rural schools. But the delivery trucks had reinforced suspension systems that suggest they were carrying much heavier cargo than computers. Sarah paused near a fountain in the center of the square, using the sound of running water to mask her voice. Team, I believe Falcon discovered that the educational supply company is a front for weapons distribution. The computer equipment deliveries are probably weapons shipments disguised as humanitarian aid. The pattern was becoming clear, but it also meant the stakes were higher than they had initially realized. If the trafficking network was using educational aid as cover, they had access to secure transportation routes and international legitimacy that would make them extremely difficult to stop through conventional means. Overwatch, how long before the suspected personnel movement? Sarah asked, knowing that timing would be critical for any action they took. Based on the radio traffic patterns, I estimate 30 to 45 minutes before they begin moving people or equipment, Tommy replied. After that, the building will probably be empty except for minimal security. Sarah made a decision that drew on everything she had learned about unconventional problem solving. Team, we're not going to attempt a rescue operation. Instead, we're going to gather intelligence that will allow us to track their network and locate Falcon at their destination. She outlined her plan quickly. Dr. Hassan would approach the educational supply company under the pretense of seeking funding for a school project, allowing her to observe the interior layout and personnel. Marcus would position himself to photograph vehicles and personnel during the expected movement. Tommy would focus on intercepting and recording communications that might reveal their destination. What about you, Phoenix? Marcus asked. What's your role in this plan? Sarah smiled grimly as she studied the building one more time. I'm going to follow them. The trafficking network thinks they're invisible because they use legitimate cover and avoid military-style operations. But they haven't planned for someone who can blend in completely and think like they do. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, but it played to the team's strengths rather than trying to overcome their limitations through force. As Sarah positioned herself for the next phase of the operation, she reflected on how far she had come from the struggling recruit who couldn't complete basic training exercises. Commander Harrison had been right about failure teaching valuable lessons. Her inability to succeed through conventional methods had forced her to develop unconventional approaches that were perfectly suited for exactly this type of mission. Now, instead of following standard military procedures, she was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective operations are the ones that don't look like military operations at all. The radio traffic Tommy was monitoring suddenly intensified, indicating that the network's movement was beginning earlier than expected. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to put her abilities to the ultimate test. Knowing that Falcon's life and the success of their mission depended on her ability to think differently under pressure, Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall of an ancient building as the convoy of vehicles rumbled past her hiding spot. For the past 6 hours, she had been following the trafficking network through the winding mountain roads of the Hindu Kush, maintaining visual contact while staying completely undetected. Her motorcycle, a battered Honda that perfectly matched the local transportation, allowed her to navigate terrain that would challenge larger vehicles. The convoy consisted of 3 trucks disguised as educational supply vehicles, complete with painted logos of international aid organizations. Sarah had managed to attach a small tracking device to the lead truck during a fuel stop, but she needed to maintain visual contact to ensure she could locate their final destination, even if the electronic signal was lost in the mountainous terrain. Her earpiece crackled with Tommy's voice from their base camp 50 miles away. "Phoenix, I'm still tracking your signal, but communication is going to become unreliable as you move deeper into the mountains. Are you certain about continuing this pursuit alone?" "Affirmative, Overwatch," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of her motorcycle engine. "The convoy is moving with purpose toward a specific destination. If we lose them now, we may never find Falcon or understand the full scope of this network." The terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous as the convoy climbed higher into the mountains. Sarah had to maintain a careful balance between staying close enough to track the vehicles and remaining far enough back to avoid detection. Her training in surveillance techniques was being tested by conditions that no classroom exercise could have duplicated. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, the convoy turned off the main road onto a barely visible track that wound through a narrow valley. Sarah stopped her motorcycle and used binoculars to observe the route ahead. The track appeared to lead toward a cluster of buildings nestled against the mountainside, partially concealed by natural rock formations. "This has to be their primary facility," she murmured to herself, recognizing the tactical advantages of the location. The buildings were positioned to be invisible from aerial surveillance, accessible only through the single mountain track, and defendable by a small force against a much larger attacking group. Sarah secured her motorcycle among rocks and brush, then began the careful process of moving closer to the compound on foot. The skills she had developed during training served her well as she navigated across rough terrain, while remaining invisible to any security patrols. Her small size and methodical approach allowed her to move through areas where larger, more aggressive operatives might have been detected. From a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the compound, Sarah began documenting everything she observed. The facility was much larger than it had appeared from the distance. Several buildings were connected by covered walkways, and she could see multiple vehicle bays carved directly into the mountainside. The level of infrastructure suggested this was a permanent operation rather than a temporary staging area. Through her scope, Sarah observed personnel moving between buildings with obvious military discipline despite their civilian clothing. Most significantly, she identified what appeared to be sophisticated communications equipment on the roof of the main building, indicating that this facility served as a command center for operations across a wide geographic area. Her attention was drawn to movement near the largest building as several men escorted a figure in Western clothing toward what looked like a detention facility. Even at a distance, Sarah could see that the prisoner's build and movement matched the physical description of their missing agent. "Falcon is alive and being held in the main compound," she reported through her radio, hoping the signal would reach Tommy despite the mountainous terrain. "Repeat. Target is alive but appears to be under guard in a detention facility. Sarah spent the next several hours conducting detailed surveillance, mapping the compound's layout, identifying security measures, and documenting personnel movements. Her methodical approach revealed patterns that would be crucial for planning any rescue operation. Guard rotations occurred every 4 hours, vehicle movements followed predictable schedules, and the compound's defenses were focused on preventing vehicle-based attacks rather than infiltration by individuals. As midnight approached, Sarah noticed increased activity around the communications facility. Several vehicles arrived carrying personnel who appeared to be senior leadership, based on the deference shown by the guards. Through her scope, she observed what appeared to be a planning session in the main building, with maps and documents spread across tables visible through large windows. Her training in intelligence analysis allowed her to piece together fragments of information into a comprehensive picture. The timing of the leadership meeting, combined with the earlier movement from the marketplace, suggested that the network was planning a major operation. The weapons trafficking was likely just one component of a larger destabilization effort that could affect the entire region. Sarah's radio suddenly crackled with an unexpected transmission. The voice was weak and intermittent, but she immediately recognized the emergency frequency that Falcon had been instructed to use if he ever had the opportunity to communicate. Anyone receiving Falcon, requesting immediate extraction, have critical intelligence on network. Operations location compromised. The transmission faded to static, but it confirmed that Falcon was indeed alive and had somehow gained access to communications equipment. Sarah faced a critical decision. The original plan had been to gather intelligence and report back to headquarters for a coordinated rescue operation. But Falcon's communication suggested that waiting for backup might be too late. If his location was compromised, the network might move him to a more secure facility or eliminate him entirely. Drawing on the unconventional thinking that had brought her this far, Sarah developed a plan that used the network's own procedures against them. She had observed that supply vehicles regularly arrived at the compound during nighttime hours to avoid satellite surveillance. If she could intercept one of these vehicles and assume the driver's identity, she might be able to enter the compound without triggering their security measures. Her opportunity came at 2 a.m. when a single truck approached the compound along the mountain track. Sarah positioned herself at a narrow section of the road where the vehicle would have to slow down significantly. As the truck rounded a sharp curve, she stepped into the roadway wearing the local clothing she had used for her cover identity. The driver stopped immediately, assuming she was a local resident who needed assistance. Sarah approached the passenger window and began speaking in the regional dialect Dr. Hassan had taught her, explaining that her motorcycle had broken down and asking for help. When the driver opened his door to examine her supposedly disabled bike, Sarah used non-lethal techniques she had learned during training to subdue him quietly. Within minutes, she had secured the unconscious driver in a concealed location and assumed control of his truck. The vehicle contained legitimate educational supplies mixed with concealed weapons, confirming their intelligence about the network's methods. More importantly, the truck provided her with the perfect cover for entering the compound. As Sarah drove toward the compound's main gate, she forced herself to remain calm despite the enormity of what she was attempting. The guards would be expecting this delivery, but they would also be alert for anything unusual. Her success would depend on her ability to act naturally, while being prepared to adapt instantly if the situation changed. The guard at the gate waved her through without close inspection, apparently recognizing the truck and expecting the delivery. Sarah parked in the designated area and began unloading supplies, using the activity to observe the compound's interior layout and identify the building where Falcon was likely being held. She was about to discover that her real test wasn't getting into the compound, but getting both herself and Falcon out alive, while carrying intelligence that could prevent a regional catastrophe. The skills she had developed through failure and unconventional training were about to face their ultimate challenge. Sarah moved through the compound with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, carrying a clipboard and checking items off a supply list while mentally mapping every detail of the facility. The guards paid little attention to her, assuming she was part of the regular supply chain that kept their operation functioning. Her systematic approach to reconnaissance, learned through months of failure and adaptation, was allowing her to gather crucial intelligence while maintaining her cover. The detention facility was a reinforced building at the rear of the compound, positioned against the mountain wall with only one accessible entrance. 2 guards maintained a lazy watch, their attention focused more on staying warm in the cold mountain air than on vigilant security. Sarah observed their routine for 20 minutes, noting that they checked the prisoner every hour but spent most of their time playing cards and drinking tea. Her opportunity came when one guard left to use the latrine while the other dozed in his chair. Sarah approached the building carrying a box of medical supplies, speaking confidently to the remaining guard in the local dialect. "Emergency delivery for the prisoner. Orders from the commander." The guard, barely awake and unwilling to question what appeared to be routine supply activity, unlocked the door without close inspection of her credentials. Sarah entered the building and immediately locked the door behind her, buying precious time before her deception would be discovered. Falcon was being held in a small room at the end of a narrow corridor. When Sarah opened the door, she found Agent David Park, a seasoned intelligence operative whose appearance showed the effects of 6 weeks in captivity. Despite his condition, his eyes immediately focused on her with sharp intelligence. "Who are you?" he whispered, clearly prepared to resist if she represented a threat. "Phoenix, sent by Commander Harrison. We're getting you out of here. But I need to know what intelligence you've gathered." Sarah began cutting his restraints with a knife from her supply kit while speaking in urgent, quiet tones. Park rubbed circulation back into his hands while rapidly briefing her on his discoveries. "This network isn't just trafficking weapons. They're coordinating with multiple terrorist organizations to destabilize the entire region simultaneously. I documented meetings with representatives from 6 different groups, all planning coordinated attacks timed for maximum impact." He pulled a small device from a concealed pocket in his clothing. "Everything is on this drive. Operational plans, financial records, communication protocols, and the identities of network leadership across 4 countries. This intelligence could prevent attacks that would kill thousands of people." Sarah secured the drive in her equipment belt, while helping Park prepare for immediate movement. "Can you travel quickly across rough terrain? Our extraction route requires several hours of mountain travel." "I can do whatever is necessary," Park replied, his professionalism evident despite his weakened condition. "But the compound's communication center monitored my emergency transmission. They know I made contact with outside forces. Security will be increased significantly within hours." The sound of vehicles arriving outside confirmed Park's assessment. Through a small window, Sarah observed multiple trucks disgorging armed personnel who were clearly preparing for enhanced security operations. The easy infiltration she had achieved was about to become a much more challenging extraction. "We need to move now, before they complete their security lockdown," Sarah said, leading Park toward the building's rear exit. "I have transportation cached outside the compound, but we need to reach the perimeter without being detected." Using the same systematic approach that had brought her this far, Sarah analyzed their escape route options while they moved through the building. The direct route to the perimeter would require crossing open ground where they would be visible to multiple guard positions. Alternative routes through the vehicle maintenance area would provide better concealment but might delay them long enough for the security sweep to discover their escape. Park's experience proved valuable as they navigated through the compound. His weeks of observation had given him detailed knowledge of the facility's layout and the personnel's habits. "The fuel depot has minimal lighting and only 1 guard. If we can reach that area, we can follow the fuel lines to an access point in the perimeter fence." Sarah adapted her plan based on Park's information, demonstrating the flexibility she had learned through unconventional training. Instead of forcing their way through obstacles, they would use the compound's own infrastructure to facilitate their escape. The route to the fuel depot required careful timing to avoid guard patrols that were becoming more frequent as security increased. Sarah used techniques learned during her surveillance training to predict patrol patterns and identify brief windows when specific areas would be unmonitored. They reached the fuel depot without detection, but the final challenge proved to be the most difficult. The access point Park had identified was secured with an electronic lock that would trigger alarms if tampered with incorrectly. Sarah's computer programming background became crucial as she analyzed the lock circuitry and developed a method to bypass its security features. "I need 3 minutes to override this system without triggering alerts," she told Park while examining the electronic components. Can you provide early warning if anyone approaches? Park positioned himself to observe the surrounding area, while Sarah worked with tools from her supply kit. The lock's design was more sophisticated than she had expected, requiring her to trace multiple circuit pathways and identify the correct sequence for disabling the alarm system. With 30 seconds remaining before the next patrol was scheduled to pass their location, Sarah successfully bypassed the lock. The access gate opened silently, providing them with a concealed exit route that led directly to the mountainside, where her motorcycle was hidden. The journey down the mountain tested both Sarah's driving skills and Park's endurance. They traveled without lights to avoid detection, navigating treacherous terrain by memory and instinct. Park, despite his weakened condition, provided crucial guidance about terrain features that weren't visible in the darkness. As dawn broke over the mountains, they reached the rendezvous point where Tommy Chen was waiting with extraction vehicles and communication equipment. The relief on Tommy's face was evident as he saw both team members emerge safely from what had been an extremely dangerous solo operation. "Phoenix, that was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," Tommy said while helping Park into the vehicle. "Command is going to have strong opinions about your decision to attempt extraction without backup." Sarah smiled as she secured the intelligence drive that Park had protected through weeks of captivity. Sometimes the best operations are the ones that don't follow standard procedures. We have intelligence that could prevent a regional catastrophe, and we extracted an experienced agent who can help analyze the network's full structure. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in Commander Harrison's office at Naval Special Warfare Command, receiving a commendation for exceptional performance during an operation that had resulted in the disruption of a major terrorist network. The intelligence Park had gathered, combined with Sarah's reconnaissance, had enabled coordinated strikes that prevented multiple planned attacks. "Martinez, when I first saw you failing basic training at Fort Benning, I knew you had potential that couldn't be measured by conventional standards," Harrison said as he presented her with advanced training opportunities. "Your success proves that sometimes our greatest assets are the people who don't fit traditional molds." Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from basic training failure to special operations success. The qualities that had made her unsuccessful as a conventional soldier, her analytical approach, methodical thinking, and ability to find alternative solutions, had proved to be exactly what unconventional warfare required. Her failure had become the foundation for a completely different kind of success, proving that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from learning to adapt when standard methods don't work. Commander Harrison had been right about failure teaching lessons that success never could, and Sarah had discovered that being different wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a strength to develop and use.